Immigration and Customs Enforcement must release children held in the country's 3 family detention centers by July 17th because of the danger posed by the coronavirus pandemic. A federal judge in Los Angeles ordered. U.S. District Judge Dolly G. said in a ruling Friday that children held for more than 20 days at ICE facility residential centers should be released by July 17 to non-congregate settings that include suitable sponsors and even to their own parents, who can be released if conditions warrant it. I'm going to read a little bit more, and this is a piece from June 26th, about 3 days before we're recording this particular podcast. The centers are, quote, on fire, per NBC News reporting, and there is no more time for half measures, G wrote. She cited unevenly implemented written protocols, employees with COVID-19 at one Texas facility, and 11 detainees with the virus at a family residential center in Kansas. So everybody, welcome to What to Read. Immigration is a story that was, we did it like continually last year, especially last summer, when I was one of the reporters who got a chance to go to Tornillo, which was in Texas, which is around on the Texas-Mexico border, in the El Paso area, where we were allowed to tour through a facility that was holding separate migrant children. Now, these were not children who had been taken from their parents. They weren't separated by the government from their parents. They had come unaccompanied to the United States, but they had come unaccompanied with the goal of going to an uncle or an aunt or a grandma. Like, they had a person that was receiving them, but they were cut off at the border, and rather than being allowed to go to their family member who's in the United States, who may even be a U.S. citizen, they were stopped and they were put in this massive camp. And the camp that they were in looked like a military camp. It looked like a military encampment. And the people who built it normally build encampments for like hurricanes, when they have to evacuate like a whole town for a hurricane. But the way they build it, it looks literally like you're on a military camp. And the day that we went there, they had laid down sod, and you could tell it was brand new, fresh sod, because it was brand new. It was laid out to make a soccer field. And we, those of us journalists who were there, definitely read that as being for us, to make it look like, oh, this is a cute facility. It's like a summer camp. It's like summer camp. It was not like summer camp. It was in the middle of nowhere. The kids were as young as just looking at them, they looked 6, 7, 8 years old, all the way up to about 15. The boys were separated from the girls. The boys were in one facility. The girls were in another facility. There was a mess hall where they could eat. There was a bunk facilities where they could sleep in bunk beds. They were all in bunk beds like they were in the Army. They were drawings on the walls of the place that the one bunk bed facility we went in that had maybe like 40 kids in it. And on the walls, I'll never forget these pictures. There was one that looked like a Jesus on the cross, but like a weeping Jesus on the cross. That was one. There was another one that just looked like The Walking Dead. They had drawn all the pictures were just dour, and these were little kid pictures. You could tell they were little kid pictures. They were in crayon, and they looked like little kid drawing. So these are not drawn by the older kids. These are the younger kids.
You know what's so funny? I'm just sitting here amazed. This was back in June of 2018 you went, right?
Yep.
We're in June of 2020.
Yes.
I wonder how many of those children are still in those detention camps 2 years later.
That's a good question. And because when we walked through there, they wouldn't let us talk to the kids. We couldn't actually say anything to the children, right? So we were told the only thing you're allowed to ask is buenos dias, meaning, hello, good day. ¿Cómo estás? How are you doing? ¿Cómo está la comida? How's the food? And that's it. You could say, ¿de dónde eres? Where are you from? But that's it. If you ask any other questions, you'd be thrown out. If you tried to ask them how you're being treated, you'd be thrown out. Those are the only things you're allowed to ask. So, we were going through saying, hola, ¿cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo estás? ¿Cómo está la comida? ¿De dónde eres? And they would just look at you with these big brown eyes that just stare at you. Very few of them answered. They just looked at you. They look terrified.
I mean, if you think about it, if there are still children there, it's like indefinite detention. It's like they're at Gitmo. I mean, honestly,
it looked like Gitmo.
I mean,
it looked like Gitmo.
It's appalling if there's still. I mean, there's so much going on. We don't even know what's happening with these kids anymore.
It looked like Gitmo. It looked like Gitmo to me. I mean, it did not look like any place any child should be. Let me put it that way. And there was a little facility for medical, but there were only 10 beds in it. So now, if COVID were, if that facility is still standing, and COVID breaks out there are only 10 beds where we were. That's it. There were definitely not enough doctors and nurses. There was one doctor and a couple of nurses. These people are not trained to deal with childhood trauma. There was no psychologist at all. There was a phone room where you could see kids who were trying to make their phone call, because they would get like one phone call periodically to try to either call, a family member, or if there was a legal person. A lot of them, they come with their name stitched on them, like a piece of paper that's pinned on them. So, and the name of the person they were trying to meet. So it's, mi tia Maria, and that's her name. They would have her first and last name pinned on them. So they knew where they were supposed to go. Let's not pretend that the government didn't know where these children were meant to go, because the family member's name was pinned on them, and they often had the family member's phone number. So when most of the time, these are kids from Guatemala, Honduras, coming from war countries where there were basically drug lord wars going on, where drug lords would try to recruit 10-year-old boys and make them be drug runners. And if they don't do it, they would kill them and their mom and their dad and their whole family. So once the drug gangs try to get at these kids, a lot of times the families send the boys especially away. And they say, rather than have you stay here and either join this gang or be killed by the gang, they just send them. And so these are desperate people. These are desperate children for the most part. And the girls who were sent, a lot of them had incredible trauma on this road from coming. Can you imagine walking or riding on top of a train? Not in the train, on the top of a train, meaning the heat, the dust.
For several months.
Depending
on where you're coming from.
Depending on how far. This could be for weeks. It could be for months to try to get all the way, illegally into the United States. And here's the thing, when they present themselves, I shouldn't even say illegally into the United States, trying to get legally into the United States, because what they do is they come to the border and they present themselves as refugees. They're actually not trying to get into the United States illegally. What they're saying is, I'm a refugee, please take me. And then what happens is the United States grabs them and throws them in lockup, basically in prison. It's prison. Like, you can't describe this as anything other than prison. That's what it is.
My thing is also, again, what do they intend to do with these children? I mean, I know we had a podcast with Maria before, and we was talking about how they were flying kids all over the country. And now, are they even keeping track of where these children are nowadays? So, I mean, as a parent, how do you find your child?
Right. I can remember when our kids would, our middle son used to love to run into the clothing racks, right? So, we'd go to the store, we'd go shopping, and he'd run into the clothing. He thought that was the most hilarious thing ever. When you lose your child in the store for 5 minutes and you're calling them and they're not answering you, can you think about the panic? And I remember being a kid, and
this is in Florida. You got to be careful in Florida.
Hello. And, and I just think about the times when, as a little kid myself, I would get separated from my mom in the store, because I did the same thing that our middle son did, hiding in the clothes or just wandering off to look at toys. And then you look around and mom and your sister and brother are not in front of you. The panic that you feel when you don't find your mom or dad for 5 minutes. Think about the panic as a parent or child, especially these little kids, that their parent is just gone, that they say, hey, you come with me for a second. Your mom will be there when you get back, and you come back and the mom is gone.
Cruelty.
For a lot of the kids, we've seen videos of parents then trying to reunite when they finally get their kid back, and the child won't go to them because they don't know if the parent abandoned them, if the parent left them on purpose. They don't know if the parent wanted to leave them. They have no idea. They just know that one minute the mom is there, and the next minute the mom is gone. In other cases, some of the kids were too young to even know who the mom is. They can't articulate the name of the mom because they're 2. Or they're 1, or they're a breastfeeding infant.
See, and those are the ones that hurts me the most, because they basically giving up their child, and they don't even know who their parents are. That is the worst.
And we're finding that in some cases they're placed with a family that is a foster family that then tries to adopt the kid, tries to adopt a child who is not up for adoption.
They stole my child.
Right. And so there have been cases. There was one case that I remember reading about when all this was happening. We spoke to an ACLU person. I didn't want to be an alarmist. So I was like, let's bring on somebody onto AM Joy who's from the ACLU and ask them, have there been instances where these children who are taken from the parents, so we're not talking about the unaccompanied children, we're talking about the children taken, or they come unaccompanied and they don't go to where they're supposed to go, they're just unaccompanied. What happens to those kids? The littlest ones, because there are a lot of parents out there that want to adopt. and they're not always children to adopt that they want. And now a beautiful little child is there available, and you say, I'll foster the kid. And then you say, you know what, I'm keeping the kid. I want this to be my child. I'm going to adopt them. But the parent is missing. So the parent, you could say, well, they gave up their right because they're missing. We don't know where they are. They're still in Guatemala.
Abandoned their child. That's like a perfect excuse.
And there have been instances of this where then the parent finally locates who's got their child, tries to get the child back, and loses in custody.
Unbelievable.
Loses in a custody battle to an American parent. So this is stealing of children, right? So
exactly what it is.
And there's going to be this whole generation of stolen children, whether they were temporarily stolen and eventually given back to the parent, whether they're traumatized in the United States and then deported back to Guatemala, where they're then in danger, or whether they are allowed somehow to stay in the United States, but they're not with their mom, they're not with their dad, they're with another relative, and their parent is thousands of miles away, and they have no hope of bringing the parent. You know, the idea that a country would traffic in that kind of on purpose in taking babies, children, teenagers, whatever age you are, your bond to your parents is the first bond that you form as a human. And the idea that callously our government, the United States government, ripped that bond apart for no other reason than they could. And that because Donald Trump had promised to reduce the levels of illegal, quote unquote, immigration.
Or to be cynical, some social experiment that they're doing.
To say, you know, we're going to reduce the percentage of brown immigrants by this cruelty. They did this, the Trump administration did. They also barred refugees, and we created the whole system of refugee settlement we did, the United States. But the United States was refusing refugees from Africa, from African countries, and from Middle Eastern countries, and from South America. What do they all have in common? Brown, and black. And this is such a sinister thing, and it's so unbelievable. It's not unbelievable that America would do it because, you know, the United States did this to indigenous people. Indigenous children throughout, and I believe this was mostly in like the 40s and 50s, were taken out of the, quote, reservations, the places we shoehorned them and shoved them after we stole their land and stole their nations and put them on these reservations. And then oftentimes the children would be taken off the reservations and put in these schools. They essentially were like, you're going away to school. But the schools were to try to re-educate them and to make them have a more European zeitgeist, to take away their native language, their traditions, their culture, and
social experiment,
right, and to replace it with a more a white American culture. And this was done for decades to indigenous children. You know, American history is so full of these kinds of stories. We just don't know them because we don't learn them.
And a lot of Christians do the same thing.
And people don't know that this is where that this isn't something new that we're doing. We did this to, obviously, African families where they were separated.
Exactly.
Right, where they were stolen from their moms and dads and sold off as like cattle, like it's a cow instead of a human. And sold off as if there was no bond between the mother and the child. The treatment of Africans were to say that, well, they don't have this, you know, it was as if, well, they don't have the same bond with their children. We can just take this baby, we can take this toddler, we can take this teenager, rip them away from their mom and dad while they're screaming, put them on a cart and send them down to Mississippi because we got $300 for them. And so this is a part of American culture. The idea of child separation is not new at all. It's actually in the finest tradition of American history. It's just now we're doing it to migrants.
This is America.
Correct. And it's shocking and it's shameful, except that it's comes in the wake of other modern history that's shocking and shameful, like torture during the Iraq War. As if you could take somebody and drag them out of their village, separate them from their community and their family, and shock their genitals to try to force them to admit that Saddam Hussein who was a Sunni Muslim, was working with Al-Qaeda.
And then leave them on a Caribbean island indefinitely.
Right. And Al-Qaeda, you know, believed that people like Saddam Hussein were heretics. So there's no reason why these people would work together, but in the minds of a lot of people who just have a thing against Muslims. They are all just one group. And so we have a history here, and we have to deal with all of these parts of our history in order to grow. But this history is not ancient history. This is history that is current. It's still happening. And we have a great guest on to talk about this history that's still happening, the separation of migrant children and parents. We have a great guest. Let's bring him in. And joining me now is a really terrific journalist who you've gotten to know on MSNBC as well as NBC News, reporting on the shocking American tragedy of child separations, migrant child separations. We reported together in Tornillo, but he has just been doing a fantastic job of telling this horrible story, which he's been witness to. He calls himself an unlikely witness to this American tragedy. The book is called Separated: Inside an American Tragedy. And of course, the author is Jacob Soboroff, my friend from MSNBC. Hey, Jacob.
Hey, Joy, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
No, of course. And I'm glad that you wrote this all down. There were so many times in Tornillo that I thought I need to be taking notes. Just in my head, I was taking notes and then going home and having nightmares. Just tell us about how you got on this beat of covering these child separations. What was the first story that you did that sort of launched this series?
Well, I honestly, part of the reason that I wrote the book is that despite having spent so much time covering immigration, and when Donald Trump ran for president, everybody remembers the first thing that Donald Trump said as he came down the escalator, or after he came down the escalator, was that he believed Mexicans were rapists and criminals. I mean, it was unavoidable that immigration was going to be a central topic in the presidency of Donald Trump. And being from Southern California and Los Angeles, a 50% Latinx population, it's almost like living in Los Angeles. The issue of immigration is unavoidable. So before I was ever at MSNBC in 2014, I covered the Obama administration's deportations for a small network that I worked with called Pivot. And when I ultimately got here, DACA was a topic that was on people's minds. And I got here at the end of 2015, covered the 2016 election, and it was just a no-brainer to start covering immigration. But really the topics that I was covering and Donald Trump got people thinking about were mass deportations from the interior, right? People getting rounded up and deported back to their country, many of whom had never been to that country other than as little children, specifically talking about DACA recipients. And then the wall. The wall was the big thing. Is he going to build it? Is Mexico going to pay for it? Is he going to be able to do it? And so those were the things that I was focused on. And I had done multiple stories about those topics, and even started working on a Dateline hour for NBC, for the network, about the reality of life along the border, which was so often different on the ground than the way Donald Trump described it. Frankly, he had no idea. Yeah. But separations was not a thing that was on my radar. And so ultimately, when family separations did start happening, and I ended up in the middle of it, it came embarrassingly as a somewhat of a surprise to me that something this horrific could be perpetrated by the government of the United States of America. And because I had been covering the border itself and so many border issues, I happened to be at the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. And that's how I ended up in the middle of separations. I was invited to one of the centers who I had, by someone in the Trump administration who I'd been working with on this documentary, to cover it as media. And then there I was, looking at 1,500 boys living in a former Walmart, 250,000 square feet in Brownsville, Texas on June 13th, 2018. And I will never, ever forget it. I'd never seen anything like it in my life. And a few days later, I ended up in the epicenter of the separations in McAllen, where it's what everybody remembers: the kids in cages, covered by Mylar blankets, on floors, on top of mats, guarded by a security contractor in a watchtower. It makes me sick every time I think about it, every time I talk about it. And I didn't intend to be there. And then I ended up in the middle of it. I was an unlikely eyewitness to one of the most shameful chapters in modern American history.
And when you talk to officials at places like McAllen or places where there were little kids, in some cases kids who were still breastfeeding, who had been taken from their mothers, mothers who had no idea where their kids were, how did officials in these places explain what they were doing, if they explained it at all?
Well, many of them would say that they're just the operators, right? That they're carrying out orders. But I distinctly remember, and I write about in the book, that one of the officials in the McAllen processing station, the epicenter, said to me, we're strained and we're stressed and we're struggling. We're overtaxed here. We're not licensed social care workers. We're not child care professionals. That's what HHS does, right? And the Border Patrol was the ones tasked with ripping babies away, like you say, some breastfeeding from their moms, and in some cases from their dads. And I write about in the book a particular story of a father and a son who flee Guatemala and were taken from each other in Yuma, Arizona, where I just was with President Trump last week. I think for a lot of Border Patrol agents, it devastated them because they were carrying out orders. There were others that were certainly that relished the opportunity to do this. And, what you'll see in the book is that as early as Valentine's Day 2017, just a couple weeks after the inauguration, people that had wanted to do this practice systematically in CBP and the Border Patrol and ICE during the Obama administration and were prevented from doing it, got together and they talked about, how do we implement this under President Trump? Let's end what they call catch and release, basically allowing asylum seekers to come into the country after they're apprehended, allowing them to go into the community and report back when it's time for their court case. And Donald Trump wanted to end it. Jeff Sessions wanted to end it. John Kelly, the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, later Chief of Staff, wanted to end it. And almost from day one, they started hatching the plan about how do we do this. And ultimately, after about a year of hiding it, it exploded into the public consciousness.
And your book reads like a diary. A lot of it is, sort of the experience that you have going through it, which is, it's a harrowing diary. But it starts as you said, in 2017. But I know your reporting, does, as you said, go back to the Obama administration. A lot of people that are loyalists to Donald Trump say that it was President Obama who started the idea of the cages. What do you know about that? Was there a difference between the way that these two policies worked and what the Obama administration did when kids came unaccompanied, or did they ever separate kids?
It's a very important question, and it is a very specific answer to that. The truth of the matter is, and everybody should recognize this, that the Obama administration was widely criticized for many of its immigration policies. He deported more people than any president in history, despite the fact he put into place many progressive policies, including DACA, and attempts to give protection to DACA recipients' parents as well. But when faced with a significant influx of Central American migrant children in 2012, 2014, and 2016, they had Border Patrol stations overflowing with young children who were coming here alone to seek asylum. Because of that, they built the McAllen Border Patrol processing station, which is the facility that had the cages in which the separated children I saw were placed into. And I don't think anybody denies that. What everybody must remember is that the Obama administration was not placing systematically separated children taken from their parents, 5,000 of them ultimately, according to the official count, into that facility. It doesn't excuse that the facility is an inhumane facility, and I think today everybody agrees that should not be the conditions that migrants are kept in. But the Obama administration never, ever, and I want to be really clear about this, and this was something that Cecilia Munoz talked to me about on the record in the book. Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, talked to me about in the book. He said he rejected it outright. It wasn't something that they could ever consider in order to deter families from coming here, essentially torture them. What the American Academy of Pediatrics says will give lifelong trauma to these children, and Physicians for Human Rights, a Nobel Peace Prize winning organization, says meets the clinical definition of torture to these children. And that is what the Trump administration consciously did, something that Obama administration never did, never came close to doing. If it was up to the Trump administration, you could read about this in the book too, they would have separated 5 times as many children, maybe 30,000 children, giving them, lifelong trauma. And there are specific people, along the way that I didn't know about at the time, but in going back and sort of retracing my steps, I've learned about that warned about this. They warned about it time after time, that separating children will damage them for a lifetime. And those warnings were ignored by the Trump administration. They moved forward with it anyway.
Yeah, and in chapter 2 of your book, Separated, you write, you open with an incident report. Age 5, child's country of birth, Guatemala. Admitted date, 6/15/2018. ORR placement date, 6/13/2018. Current location, Bronx, New York. Because one of the things that did happen is that children were moved around. And here's how it starts. Synopsis of event. During risk assessment, minor reported that due to separation from his aunt and cousin at the border, he was developing suicidal ideations. Description of incident. Minor reported that he was separated from his aunt and his 6-year-old cousin. Minor reports that he's developing suicidal ideations while detained after the separation. Ideations are active and no plan, no intent, and no HX. This is a 5-year-old. And we're talking about 5-year-olds who need their mom stolen from their mom and feeling suicidal. This is insane. I don't have a question. This is just insane.
It is, right? And you know, you were there in Tornillo, right? The idea that you're going to build pop-up, look, there have been soft-sided tent facilities, extra facilities because of influx of children before the Trump administration ever existed. But the idea that they needed overflow capacity in what is essentially a social service organization, HHS, to take care of thousands of traumatized children only because the Trump administration decided to do it on purpose in order to basically, forgive me for saying this, but scared the shit out of other migrants from coming to the United States. It is disgusting. And I struggled, I write about this too. I struggled with how to talk about this on our air, as a reporter, as a father of a young child at the time, 2 years old. My son was 1 to 2 years old during this time period. And there is no other way to interpret it when you see it yourself. When you stood outside that, I remember the day so crystal clearly, when you stood outside and the wind was blowing and you were reporting live from Tornillo. And I actually had just gotten back because I went back to New York to put the finishing touches on the Dayline Hour that aired that day. It was the 24th or 23rd of June, 2018. I remember these days like they were yesterday. And when you see it yourself and you understand what our government is perpetrating on defenseless children, there is no other way to describe it than despicable and horrific and a true American tragedy. And that's why I called it an American tragedy. Yeah. This is America doing this, right? Like, this isn't some evil, faraway place that we want to criticize or go invade or go take before the United Nations or put on trial for war crimes. This is us. Yeah. And that's a reckoning. That's why I called it Separated too, because it's not just the physical act of what happened to the children. It's our own mental separation as Americans from what our country is doing to people on our own land. And until we realize that, this or some version of this deterrence-based immigration is just going to continue to happen. And it's happening right now. Attempted separations are happening right now. Again, 2 years later. And we just can't forget it.
Absolutely. And, you do write about, some of the stories. You write about two boys named Juan and Jose who came across, they got on a bus and they wound up in San Luis, Arizona. You talk about some of the reasons why people come. Did you get a sense of kind of, was there a general set of categories of why people are coming? I mean, because the Trump administration makes it sound like they just want to come and get welfare. They make it sound like people just want to come to change the population density of the United States and make it more minority. Like they've got some plot to all become Democratic voters and vote out Republicans. Like the crazy scare tactics, that talk about why people come. Were you able to get a sense of why people are coming, especially why children are coming alone?
I think that the bottom line, the sort of the common denominator is desperation. People flee all kinds of things to come to the United States as migrants from Central America. I myself have been to Guatemala to see people literally starving to death in what's called the dry corridor because their industry, coffee farming, is literally drying up and malnutrition is exploding in these areas. People are coming for their literal survival. in Juan and Jose's case, they were from Petén, Guatemala in the north, and they got into some trouble with local narco traffickers. I mean, it was a simple story that it was a complicated story, but pretty straightforward. He sold his vehicle to someone, and then narco traffickers wanted that vehicle from the person he sold it to. They wanted to try to get the title, and threats were involved. And instead of sitting around and seeing his own life and perhaps his son's life end, like so many others had in his area, they decided to pick up and leave. And one thing I want to say, Joy, is nobody's perfect. Yeah. Juan had come to this country twice before to seek work and return to Guatemala. You know, there aren't the truth of the matter is these aren't easy stories necessarily to understand. These aren't crystal clear reasons always for people leaving, but people are not flawless individuals. And yes, maybe this one gentleman who I chose to focus on it, and I did it on purpose. I didn't pick a story of someone who was sort of the almighty perfect example of a migrant coming to this country and going to some fancy university and making some wonderful life. He's just a regular guy who screwed up too. And that's what I wanted people to understand, is that he was leaving for a better life. And when you write about it, when they got to San Luis and they got off the bus and they crossed the border and they jumped down, they were looking for Border Patrol agents to turn themselves in. They knew that if they saw a Border Patrol agent, that represented to them a safety and security from what they were fleeing. And instead, they were taken to the Yuma Border Patrol station where Donald Trump was last week. This wasn't mentioned, rest assured, by President Trump. The father, Juan, was led into one cell. Jose was led into another cell. And they never saw each other again for 4 months. Juan was taken to Adelanto in the high desert in Southern California, about an hour or two away from where I am right now. And Jose was taken to the Harlingen BCFS shelter in South Texas, near where I saw those boys in the Walmart. And without explanation, with virtually no communication, until they ultimately were able to get in touch with one another. And it was all for, it's cliche to say it's for a better life. But it is. I mean, that is what they're seeking, and they want to protect their families, which is why, by the way, Juan and Jose, those aren't their names. Those are pseudonyms. They picked those names to protect their family that they left behind in Guatemala, that they hope that they can one day bring, to the United States.
And the other piece of I have a source that works in a facility not in the Southwest at all, in the Northeast, where some of those children that were taken from their parents wound up. And, the amount of trauma, the nightmares, the fact that they can't sleep, they won't eat, they cry. These are, 12 to 14-year-olds in this particular facility. So you hear these gut-wrenching stories. The idea that the United States was putting children and teenagers in gray sweatsuits and flying them all over the country. Have you been able to get a sense that the administration knows who these children are, who they belong to, and even how to get them back to their families if and when they ever decide to, or if the next administration decides to?
Were it not for NGOs and organizations like the ACLU, who literally went on the ground to try to track down 400 parents who were deported without their children during this time period, the answer is no. The record keeping was so poor, and I reported about it at the time, and I fleshed out the details in the book, that when high-level ICE officials were contacted by HHS at the height of the crisis, they said not only would they not be able to produce data connecting parents and children in a timely fashion, they may never be able to do it. And that's one of the things that shocked me the most, something I didn't know about at the time. There had been previous reporting by Dan Diamond at Politico, but I really dug into this in my reporting for the book, that the list, which was being informally kept by career childcare professionals in HHS who legitimately cared about these children and wanted to see them back with their parents, when that list leaked to the New York Times and was reported on by Caitlin Dickerson in April of 2018, the instinct of the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, a Trump appointee named Scott Lloyd, was to destroy the list, to get rid of it, instead of to admit what it was, develop it into a more robust and official documentation of where these children were and where their parents were, because he didn't like the fact that there was a leak of this information. Think about the negligence in having that as an idea when you're the legal custodian for thousands of children in your custody. Had he destroyed the list, those children and parents may never, ever have been linked up ever again. And that's the type of behavior that was sort of floating around this policy. It was a lack of planning on the way in, and a horrible, horrible lack of record keeping when they tried to ultimately unwind it. And the only reason they were unwinding it is because they were forced to by a federal court in San Diego. President Trump did sign the executive order on June 20th, a couple days before you went down to Tornillo. But ultimately, if it wasn't for the court, these children would never, ever have been reunited because they were forced to. The administration was forced to cooperate.
You write a bit about people like Kirstjen Nielsen and she was the Homeland Security Secretary at the time, the former Homeland Security Secretary, and the people in the administration that were doing this. Were you able to get inside what was their motivation? Because Kirstjen Nielsen seemed to try to resist being portrayed as a villain at the time. She tried to defend her behavior and even denied that separations even happened at all.
Do you remember that? You remember the tweet when she said there is no family separation policy, period?
Yep. Yeah,
I was just, what do you say to that?
Yeah.
What do you when you see it with your own eyes, what do you say to that? I didn't know what to say.
Well, in the book you have a bunch of face palms.
That's what I did. That's the only thing I knew how to do. I tweeted 3 facepalm emojis when she tweeted that out because I didn't know what to say. I had just seen with my own eyes. Again, I didn't know at the time, and this is again part of the reason that I wrote the book. But I went back and investigated. What did she know then? I mean, did she not know? Was she out of the loop? Was this Jeff Sessions doing this? Because that's certainly what people around her, want us to believe. Yeah. And it's not true. I report for the first time, I don't think this has been reported anywhere else. In fact, I'm certain of it, that she was given a legal memo by her general counsel at DHS, John Mitnick, which outlined the reasons why family separations could be found illegal and indeed unconstitutional. And she was advised that family separations could violate the due process rights, the right to the human rights of people in the United States of America and these migrants that were coming here. And she still went forward with the policy. So, if the question is she a villain? I guess you got to make that determination for yourself. But the facts are, she was presented with a document that said, you may, if you do this, you may violate the constitutional rights, the human rights of these migrants coming to the United States. And she signed on the dotted line for option 3 to implement the family separation policy nevertheless.
How much was this a Stephen Miller policy? We know that John Kelly was involved in it. Kirstjen Nielsen was involved in it. How much of it was a Stephen Miller policy? We know how he feels about non-white immigrants.
From the very earliest days, this was something that Stephen Miller was advocating for. And people throughout DHS and HHS will all tell you that he had his fingerprints all over this. I mean, the fact of the matter is he was an aide to Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, who put into place the zero tolerance policy before he was an aide to President Trump. And I recall in the book, the first time I ever saw, I think the only time I ever saw Stephen Miller face to face was in a Colorado ballroom when I was doing a live report for Rachel Maddow. And this is the type of thing that he was screaming about. He was screaming about immigrants coming to the country before Donald Trump, had ever become president. So ultimately, when he was in there, virtually everybody that you talk to in both of the agencies that were involved in this policy will point back to Stephen Miller. And I should point out, I don't like to talk about like personal relationships and stuff, but the truth of the matter is, Katie Waldman, who was the chief spokesperson for the Department of Homeland Security on the issue of family separation, and the official that invited me into both of the detention centers that I went into during the family separation policy, ended up getting into a relationship and ultimately marrying Stephen Miller after they worked together on the family separation policy. I don't even know what to say about that, but that's just the reality.
Yeah, what an interesting way to bond.
Yeah, right?
Let's talk about one of the things that I can remember thinking, and I had lunch with Maria Teresa Kumar, and we were like, what are the worst case scenarios? And for both of us, and I think you and I have talked about this, the worst case scenario was that these children would be separated. They'd be thrown into the cages. They'd be thrown into group homes or whatever facilities that the administration decided to put them in. And then somebody would get the measles or a flu would break out. some kind of pandemic would happen and it would spread rapidly because they'd be all bunched together. Children would get sick, guards would get sick, take that sickness home to their families, then their families would get sick, and you'd then have a pandemic. This is something we talked about a lot. And now we've seen that a judge has had to order the Trump administration to let some families go, some migrant families go, because a pandemic has broken out, coronavirus. Is this something that at the time, we know there were some flu deaths, there were some other deaths in custody. Talk a little bit about that. Were there protections for particularly the children who were being held? Were they being vaccinated? Were they being evaluated medically? How is it that children were dying anyway, even at the time in custody?
You raise a really, really important point, which makes me think of several things. One is, here we are, right? So over the course of the Trump administration, I think it's been 6 or 7 children died in the custody of Customs and Border Protection. Most of them, if not all of them, if I recall correctly, since family separations has ended. Before that, no child had died in CBP custody for 10 years. And everybody should understand that as a function of the Trump administration's immigration policy. I'm not proud of this, but I said at the time, live on the air with Lawrence O'Donnell, and I think other times as well, that what will ultimately happen because of deterrence-based family separation policies is you are going to have children dying as a result. People are going to try to get around this system of enforcement and come here in more dangerous and deadly ways. Ultimately, they did just that. Some children died crossing, others died in family detention. And just like you said, here we are. Now we have a pandemic and COVID, the coronavirus, is exploding in ICE detention centers. And ironically, instead of just releasing the 124 kids that are currently in kids and parents currently in family detention together, the Trump administration, and you and I talked about this on your show this weekend, the Trump administration is now considering, again, separating these families from each other in order to release the children, but not the parents. And this is in response to a judge's order. Think about that. Right now, ICE has the discretion, the Trump administration has the discretion to just let children and their families out of detention together so they don't die of coronavirus. And it's not, let's do it right now. That's not what they're thinking. They're reviewing is the exact word that they told us. They're considering what their options are instead of releasing people. And it reminds me actually of another story that's in the book. It's in the epilogue. Kirstjen Nielsen and Donald Trump were on board Marine One with Melania Trump and Ben Carson en route to survey tornado damage after a catastrophic storm. Donald Trump happened to be on his way to Mar-a-Lago, and it was a convenient stopover, it turns out. But nevertheless, they were on board Marine One together in 2019. And instead of talking about the devastation out the window or what they were about to see with the Secretary of Homeland Security, who's in charge of FEMA, of course, that was going to be delivering disaster response, President Trump asked Kirstjen Nielsen about restarting family separations. And if it wasn't for Melania Trump, it's basically saying we have to do it. Let's restart separations again. This is the mentality, again, that we're dealing with in the midst of the coronavirus. This is the man in charge of immigrants in detention who could be released today. And he said, we got to restart that, paraphrasing, but we read the exact words in the book. We got to restart that. And if it wasn't for Melania Trump interjecting, saying, no, we can't do that, and basically derailing this conversation, President Trump would have continued talking about this with Kirstjen Nielsen. He wanted to bring back family separation. So the idea that the conditions are horrific in the midst of the pandemic and it's only getting worse, the fact that that's happening is no surprise to me because all you got to do is look at the person who's in charge.
Wow. I mean, you write about the fact that according to the Physicians for Human Rights, which shared the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts to ban landmines, they issued a scathing report about the Trump administration's family separation policy. In it, the group declares, you write, Jacob, that the government's forcible separation of asylum-seeking families constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, and in all cases, PHR evaluated meets the criteria for torture. And you know, it's not as if we've not heard torture associated with the United States before, thinking about the Iraq War. So unfortunately, that's not new, but it's new when it comes to immigration. To just bring this to an end with you, Jacob, how does this get undone? Because I wonder about if Donald Trump is not president again, if he doesn't win the election, Joe Biden will inherit a situation in which we don't know how many children were separated. We don't know how many children will still be separated from their families. Do you have a sense, just from having covered this for so many years, of how do you undo this?
I'm not sure it can be undone. And when you talk to child welfare specialists, they say that childhood trauma means a century of suffering, that these children will live with this their entire lives. Juan, the father who I write about in the book, I was texting with him last week when I was at Yuma with the president. And I told him I was going to go to the place where he crossed, San Luis, Rio, Colorado. I was on the US side, but that's the Mexican side. And I said, Trump's going to be there. And he said, if you see him, ask him why he separated us and left us with psychological trauma. And that's just the reality. And I know it's a dark, depressing thing to realize, but that's why I wrote this book, that this isn't going to be undone. Even when if all the families ultimately get back together, this is not something they'll ever forget for the rest of their lives. And it will be deep down in their soul that little children, as you said, sometimes breastfeeding children, but all the way up to, teenagers were forcibly taken away from their parents by men and women in green uniforms at the Border Patrol and blue uniforms at the ports of entry, Customs and Border Protection, never knowing if they were going to see their parents again. What can be done is to legislate that these policies are never allowed to happen again. What can be done is that we all open our eyes and see that there are tens of thousands of migrants sitting directly on the other side of the border right now, waiting there because of the Trump administration's policies, virtually letting no one in today, and us all realizing that the Trump administration is carrying out, under the cover of COVID, some of the most restricted border policies they've ever attempted, things they've always wanted to do, just using coronavirus as an excuse. It's going to be, look, this was a long time coming. Border policy has been deterrence-based for decades, starting in the Clinton administration, Bush, Obama as well. But Trump took it to a place we'd never seen it before, and he continues to do that. And it is something that these families will never ever be able to escape. And that's why we all have to move forward from this together with a different consciousness about what happened and how it happened.
And I know for me, covering Black Lives Matter was complicated and difficult and traumatizing to cover it as a Black parent. For you, as you said, you had you have two kids. You have adorable
right.
children.
Thank you.
But what was it like covering it while being a parent?
And I should say, I like to hang out with your family too. We get to do the Global Citizen Festival together every year, and we always get to have that family bonding time.
Exactly.
It was hard. I mean, it was hard. Look, it is nothing like these families went through. But to have my toddler watch, this is a true story that I also write about in the book, to watch me on TV on Father's Day. Not that he knew it was Father's Day, but I did, on Father's Day 2018, inside this facility where there were hundreds of little kids just like him that were taken from their parents. And my wife sent me the video. It just made, it's a horrible thing to think about. It certainly brings back terrible memories. And I'm sure that just like everybody who got in close proximity, yourself included, to this, there's some measure of, PTSD or trauma, but it's nothing like what these families went through. I think for me, what will never leave me is that the feeling that I have about that I didn't see this happening in front of me when I had the opportunity previously. At several times as a dad, I drove almost literally right by the story, trying to cover other aspects of what was happening on the border. And I think being a parent, it certainly affected my coverage and the way that I felt about all of this. But I can never, ever wrap my head around or imagine what the families that were the victims of the policy went through.
No, 100%. No, I had nightmares after Tornillo. I just would see the little faces, their little eyes. They look at you and they didn't know what we were. We were walking through all these strangers and they're like, are you here to take me? Are you here to rescue me? Are you bad? They didn't know, because we couldn't even talk to them. We could just say a couple words to them. So I don't know how you got through doing it this day after day after day, but you did such a great job. And I actually think your personal, the fact that you brought something to it that was personal is what made your reporting so powerful, Jacob. I always love talking with you because you really you did a fantastic job. This book is important.
Thank you.
Everyone should read it. We have to face our demons as a country, and this is an opportunity to face our demons because they are demons. Jacob Soboroff, I wish you luck with the book. I hope everyone will read it. I highly recommend it and all of your reporting. You're great. Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Joy. It means the world to me. I appreciate you, and thank you for your friendship.
All right, I want to thank my buddy, Jacob Soboroff, a fantastic reporter, one of the best reporters in the business.
Great interview.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And yeah, no, Jacob has done just God's work reporting on family separations, the immigration story. He's done all these incredible pieces on the wall, on the border, on how the border is not an unsafe place. It's actually a really functioning, mutual economy between Mexico and the U.S. He's done a lot of that great work. Jacob Soboroff is a brilliant guy and also a nice guy. We always have a lot of fun at Global Citizen hanging out. That's the time we really get to hang out with Jacob. But so he's also a lot of fun. Jacob Soboroff. The book is called Separated: Inside an American Tragedy. Here is the cover. I'll show it to you again. Here is the back of the book. It's a great book. Everybody should please check it out. Yeah, Jason, thank you very much.
You're welcome, Joy. Let's tell our people to subscribe.
Yes,
to read.
Let's absolutely get everybody to please subscribe. You can subscribe on YouTube if you like the visuals. We try to make it hot for you there, but you can also subscribe on Apple iTunes and on Spotify.
Yeah, we fixed the link.
We did, and so there were some issues with the link, but we got those fixed up. We got our little technicals all together, so you can subscribe. Just Google. I was about to say Google. Search for What to Reid, REID, whether it's on Apple iTunes or on Spotify. You can also search for it by looking at hashtag What to Reid, all run together. Hashtag What to Reid. That's another way that you can find it on Spotify. So if you've had any trouble looking for it, try looking for it that way as well. Please also subscribe there.
Or if you're watching it on YouTube, the direct link is in the description, so you can get there from that also.
Absolutely. So we can get you guys those links. You can either listen, you can also watch. Please do the little bell thing on YouTube. I never remember the name of it. The notifications. Bell. Right. So that we can make sure that whenever a new episode comes out, because we have so many amazing interviews coming up, we don't want you to miss any of them. So hit the notifications. Give us some comments.
Don't forget to let them know what days are we uploading these.
Absolutely. So we are going to be uploading these every week on Tuesdays and Fridays. You'll get new episodes of What to Reid every Tuesday and every Friday. Tuesdays and Fridays. Twice a week. It's a 2 a week. So every Tuesday and Friday, you'll get new episodes of What to Reid. But you can also just do the notification to make sure you never miss them.
Are you going to have any more time left, depending on what your schedule's going to be like?
I've got plenty of time, and it's going to be amazing. We have so many great guests coming up.
So we got 2 a week, so we got to keep up that pace.
We're going to keep up our pace. 2 a week, and they're always going to be fun. And so we really wish you guys have a wonderful, 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 wonderful whatever week. It's all one big, long day. It's all one big, long day. Give us some comments and share. And we'll see you on the next What to Reid.
Bye, fam.